Berlin was not lost in a single battle. It was lost years earlier, by decisions no one wanted to question. By April 1945, the war was already over. The only thing left was denial. And Berlin would pay the price. Berlin wasn't just a city. It was the symbolic heart of the Third Reich. Whoever controlled Berlin controlled the narrative of victory. For Hitler, losing Berlin meant more than military defeat. It meant the complete destruction of his ideology. So, he made one final decision. He would defend the city at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. He poured resources into its defense that were desperately needed elsewhere. He ordered armies to hold the line. Even when those lines were crumbling, the logic was simple: if Berlin holds, the Reich holds. But this logic ignored the brutal reality unfolding across Europe. The city's symbolic importance overshadowed its strategic vulnerability. This wasn't about winning the war anymore. It was about preventing the total collapse of a worldview. The fall of Berlin would be the final, undeniable proof that the thousand-year Reich had failed. And for its leader, that was a fate worse than death. The city was to become a fortress, a last stand against the inevitable. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing on every front. The Western Allies were pushing across the Rhine. The Soviet Red Army was a monstrous force closing in from the east, just miles from the capital. Any rational observer could see the end was near. But Hitler believed something that sealed Berlin's fate. He clung to a series of fatal assumptions. He believed the grand alliance between the West and the Soviets would shatter. He thought they were the real enemies, and he could somehow play them against each other, or that the Western Allies would join him against the Soviets. And most dangerously, he believed loyalty could replace reality. In the final weeks, in his underground bunker, he moved entire phantom divisions on his maps. He would issue orders to armies that had been decimated, that had no fuel, no ammunition, no men. Generals would receive commands to launch counter-offensives with units that no longer existed. Maps were updated, orders were issued, but their armies were already gone, wiped out on the Eastern Front. This delusion wasn't just a personal failing, it was official policy. Questioning these orders was seen as defeatism, as treason. The entire command structure was built on a fantasy, and Berlin was the stage for its final, tragic performance. The Soviets, however, were not operating on fantasy. Their plan was methodical, brutal, and effective. They did not rush blindly into Berlin. Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konov, leading to massive army groups, didn't make a direct assault at first. They surrounded it. They executed a classic pincer movement on a colossal scale. Two massive fronts closed in from the north and south, slicing through German defenses, cutting off reinforcements, supplies, and any potential escape routes to the west. Within days, Berlin became an island in a Red Sea. A city under siege, defended by a motley crew of exhausted regular soldiers, old men from the Volkssturm Home Guard, and even teenagers from the Hitler Youth. The airfields were captured. The supply lines were severed. The city was completely encircled. The outcome of the battle was no longer in doubt. Only the timing was. The Soviets had set the trap, and now they began to tighten it, block by block, street by street. For the people inside Berlin, the world had shrunk to the size of their city, and soon, to the size of their neighborhood, their street, their own basement. Inside this besieged city, chaos replaced command. The intricate Nazi hierarchy, once a model of terrifying efficiency, completely broke down. Orders from the Führer bunker often contradicted each other or were based on outdated information. Communication lines were cut by artillery fire, meaning units were fighting in total isolation. Leadership vanished. High-ranking Nazi officials began to look for their own escape, abandoning their posts and their responsibilities. Entire units fought with incredible ferocity without any coordination with neighboring sectors. Others, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, surrendered without firing a shot. It was a war of pockets, of isolated struggles in apartment buildings, subway tunnels, and government offices. And still, Hitler refused to leave. even as Soviet artillery shells began landing in the government district, just meters from his bunker. Even as the city above him burned to the ground, reality had been completely replaced by the fantasy world of the bunker. He was a commander with no army, a leader with no nation, ruling over a city that was ceasing to exist. By the last week of April, Soviet forces were no longer on the outskirts. They were fighting street by street, pushing relentlessly toward the city center. Berlin was no longer a capital. It was a battlefield, a labyrinth of rubble and fire. The sounds of war were constant: the roar of tanks, the chatter of machine guns, the crump of artillery. The Reichstag, the symbolic seat of German power, became one of the final, desperate battlegrounds. Soviet soldiers, determined to raise their flag over the building before May Day, fought room by room against die-hard defenders. On April 30, 1945, with Soviet troops less than a kilometer away from his bunker, Hitler made his final decision. He did not escape. He did not surrender. He married Eva Braun, dictated his last will and testament, and then took his own life. The Third Reich, an empire meant to last 1,000 years, ended not with a glorious last stand, but with a quiet, muffled gunshot in a concrete room deep beneath the burning city. It ended with silence. A few days later, the city's remaining defenders formally surrendered. The battle for Berlin was over. So what was the real reason Berlin fell? It didn't fall simply because Germany lacked soldiers or tanks, though it certainly did. It fell because its leadership refused to adapt. It fell because ideology replaced strategy. Fanatical belief in a twisted worldview was prioritized over military common sense and tactical flexibility. It fell because loyalty to a single man was valued more than competence or honest feedback. Generals who brought bad news were dismissed. Warnings from the front lines were ignored as defeatism. This is how great powers and great wars are truly lost. Not always in a single, dramatic moment on the battlefield, but through a slow, creeping decay of reason. Through the collective decision to embrace a comfortable lie over an uncomfortable truth. Berlin's destruction wasn't an accident of war, it was the inevitable consequence of a system built on denial. The city wasn't just conquered, it was consumed by the very ideology it was meant to represent. The final defense was a defense of a fantasy, and reality always wins in the end. Berlin in 1945 was the final, brutal chapter of an empire that believed it was invincible. It is a stark reminder of what happens when a nation's leadership becomes detached from the world as it is, and instead tries to force the world to conform to what they wish it to be. And history has shown us this lesson again and again. Empires don't always collapse when they're at their weakest militarily. They often collapse when their leaders refuse to accept reality, when they choose delusion over truth until it's far too late. Thank you for watching. If you found this look into history interesting, consider subscribing for more stories like this. See you next time.